Welcome everybody. This is our fall 2025 Lawns to Legumes Pollinator Lawns project webinar. Tonight, we'll be getting into the step-by-step specifics and learning about benefits for converting your turfgrass lawn or whatever space you're working with into a pollinator lawn. And we are very grateful to be joined here by James Wolfin, who is a conservation specialist with Twin Cities Seed Company. Just a few logistics before we get started. This is a regular Zoom meeting format, so please do stay muted throughout the presentation. We will be recording this webinar and posting it to the grantee guide afterwards if you do have to leave early. Like our webinar from last week, if you were there, we'll have a presentation portion for most of the evening, and then we'll devote the remaining time to answering any questions you might have. So if you do have any questions that you're sitting with or that come up during the presentation, you can put them in the chat, and then we'll be going through the chat to answer as many as we can. So James, I'm going to pass things off to you to introduce yourself and get started.
Yeah, thank you, Megan, and thanks to the Metro Blooms and Blue Thumb staff for throwing this together. They always do a great job. I just do want to quickly introduce myself. So, I am a conservation specialist at Twin City Seed, but before that, what feels like many years ago now, as I am now an old man, I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, where bee lawns were actually the focus of my master's project. So, this is something that I'm very familiar with. I got to spend time in both the university's turfgrass science lab as well as its pollinator conservation lab. So I'm pretty darn well versed in these. When I worked for Metro Blooms not too long ago, we did a lot of educations and a lot of even some installations here and there with bee lawns. So definitely feel encouraged to share any questions you might have, anything that comes to mind, throw it in the chat and we will get to it. But for now, let's just jump into it. So I always like to start off with a little bit of context. So we're going to break this up into three portions. One, the cultural and ecological functions of the lawn, kind of getting everyone on the same page there. Then we'll talk about the actual elements of a bee lawn, kind of the building blocks of what goes into creating a bee lawn. And then three, we'll get our virtual hands dirty together and talk about how we actually install a bee lawn. It's fine and dandy to know about them, but really knowing how to get them in the ground successfully is the key here. So we'll be spending a good chunk of our time on that. So yeah, let's start with that background portion. So one of the questions that I get probably most frequently is why do we have lawns in the first place? And truthfully, that is a great question. I think this is a classic example of trying to tie together form and function. In areas where you wish to have recreation, where you want to hang out with your friends, play with your dog, have a barbecue and play lawn games. That is a fantastic area to have turf grass or a bee lawn like we're going to talk about today. But truth be told, in those areas that you're not actively using for foot traffic, play, recreation, etc., there are undoubtedly more ecologically beneficial things that you can and truthfully should be planting should you have the resources to do so. Plant that rain garden, plant that native plant garden, put in something that is going to have a stronger net impact but where you want that beautiful middle ground of this can work for my human needs of wanting to have somewhere to play, and this can also provide value to pollinators. That's truly where we see these bee lawns taking play. But again, the function of the turf grass lawn, it's a unique vegetative system that can handle a heavy deal of foot traffic. So something that I'd hope we could all agree on is that we probably have a little bit too much turf grass here in the United States and even here in Minnesota. Where if we look at this map on your left, what those areas in that green color show you is areas of high turf grass prevalence. So if you look at my old neck of the woods, the Northeast United States, in Queens, where I grew up, you see a big old blotch of green right there, high turf grass prevalence. If we look at Southern California, LA area, a whole lot of turf grass. But if we turn our focus to our very own Twin Cities here in Minnesota and many areas throughout North and South Minnesota, you see those green splotches spattered about the state, and those shows areas where turf grass is very highly prominent. We have more than three times the acreage of turf grass lawn in the US than we do irrigated corn. So there is a whole lot of turf grass in the US. We should think about at least one, how we can reduce that square footage, that footprint, or two, when we do have turf grass or where we do have an area where we wish to have recreation within the vegetation, how can we manage that for better pollinator conservation and the conservation of natural resources? The grand total that I mentioned, that 50,000 square miles, that's about 2% of the entire continental US. So if you were to throw a dart at the United States, there's a 1 in 50 chance you hit turf grass. So the basics of the solution here, we want to take that traditional turf grass lawn, which is rather monotonous, add some low-growing, pollinator-friendly forage, and create this nice matrix of turf grass and flowers. So we're not going to kick out the turf grass completely. It does still do an important job, both functionally and ecologically, of providing kind of like a mainstay of vegetation, where if we think about flowers, they come and go through the season. You do want to have some green plant material that's going to be there throughout the entirety of the year to help limit runoff, erosion control, things of that nature, and then have the flowers come and go in accordance with their bloom times. So the goals of a bee lawn, three primary goals that we'll talk about today. One, we want these to be low maintenance. Two, we want to protect pollinators. And three, we want to help improve water quality. So when I say low maintenance, and this is a term that I'll often use synonymously with low input, we're really just talking about how much upkeep does a vegetative stand require, and there are three primary characteristics that we're going to look at. One, drought tolerance. How much water does a vegetative stand need to maintain its quality? Two, the vertical growth rate. Ideally, a slower vertical growth rate is better from a natural resource conservation point of view. The reason for that being, the slower it grows, the less frequently you have to mow. And if we think about mowing, at least with a conventional gas mower, there is a whole lot of carbon emissions, a strong carbon footprint associated with mowing events. So reducing the number of mowing events required by using species with a slower vertical growth rate is better for reducing our carbon footprint when it comes to maintaining a lawn. And finally, low fertility needs. If you think about your typical traditional turfgrass lawn, that Kentucky bluegrass is an example. Many individuals are fertilizing 3 to 5 times per year. What lots of folks don't realize is that different turfgrass species and turf alternatives, like the flowers we'll be talking about today, their need for fertilizer differs, and it differs dramatically. So we want to target those species with a lower fertilizer need, the ones that aren't going to need to be babied and coddled for nitrogen throughout the season. The second goal, pollinator protection. Truth be told, I hope that this one is rather obvious. We want to actively encourage pollinators to join us in our spaces as we intentionally plant low-growing flowers that support our pollinators. And the key part here is intentionally. Some folks think that they'll just let the chickweed go or they'll just let the creeping Charlie grow, and that's the equivalent. All the flowers we're talking about today are backed by research for their value to pollinators. We're making intentional decisions about which flowers we're including, thinking about their bloom times, the species they support, their ability to tolerate mowing, their inability to overtake native plantings. So very intentional about the flowers we choose here. And the third and probably least obvious benefit we're thinking about is bee lawns and water quality, or lawns and stormwater conservation. And I'd hope when you look at this picture, you're thinking to yourself, my goodness, this is not what I expected a bee lawn to look like. And you would be exactly right. This is an example of a rain garden installed by the lovely folks at Metro Blooms. And the reason I show this is whenever I'm working with a resident and they tell me that their primary number one goal is to help improve local water quality, reduce the amount of stormwater runoff coming through the property that they manage or their home, the very first thing that I say when I'm looking at that property is let's site a rain garden. Let's try to capture as much stormwater runoff as humanly possible by um, by correctly, effectively siting that rain garden to capture the water as it moves through the green spaces that you manage. And some folks will definitely install a rain garden. Some folks will install multiple rain gardens. But what's very rare is that folks will take their entire green space and turn the whole of it into a rain garden. Rain gardens capture a ton of stormwater runoff. They do a great job of preventing water from entering our watersheds. But it's unrealistic for folks to have native plantings or rain gardens cover the entirety of their green spaces. So how I like to think of the role that a bee lawn can play within our urban green spaces, or really any managed green space that residents are taking care of, is a great way to complement the native plantings that we have in our green spaces. Of course, the ability to reduce stormwater runoff will never compare to that of a rain garden or even a tree with its incredibly deep and complex root systems. But the fact of the matter is that the grasses and flowers included in a bee lawn are deeper and more complex than that of traditional turf grass, allowing them to capture more stormwater runoff, infiltrate deeper into the ground, and create more of those pores that allow for the infiltration of water. So it's still a very strong net benefit as compared to that traditional turf grass lawn when it comes to the idea of how much water can we infiltrate into our green space. So that kind of covers the basics of where are we in the United States with turf grass, what are the basic goals that we're looking to accomplish by installing a bee lawn, and now we can get into kind of more of the nitty-gritty of what actually is a bee lawn. So we're going to work together to quite literally build this from the bottom up, thinking first about the grasses that we use here. Well, it might not be the sexiest part of the presentation. It is very important. Something that we'll come to find is that the selection of species when it comes to turf grass is pivotal in terms of how many flowers we can see in a bee lawn. And without the flowers, you don't get the bees. Without the flowers, you don't get the nectar and the pollen that they want for their food sources. Then we'll talk about some things that are more colorful and fun, like the floral species that work within a bee lawn. And then we'll talk about my favorite part, who visits a bee lawn. Um, I'm still an entomologist by nature. I'm still the guy where when I go on a walk with my fiance, we're stopping every 5 seconds because I need to look at every single bee on every single flower. So we'll talk a little bit about the bees on a bee lawn for sure. But we'll start with the what some might think is the boring part. I think it's exciting, but selecting a turfgrass species for a bee lawn. So, when we're thinking about turfgrass, what we've traditionally been doing in the world of natural resource conservation the past, 20 or 30 years or so, is thinking about how can we make these turfgrass lawns that we have more low maintenance, less irrigation, less mowing, less fertilizer applications. But now, if we want to intentionally bring flowers into the turfgrass lawn, we also have to think about grasses as a biological competitor. This means thinking about their morphology and their rate of growth. Let's look at a little example on the screen here. If we were to consider a turfgrass species with a wide leaf blade and a fast rate of growth, the worry here would be that this grass species is too competitive, it's going to really outcompete a lot of our flowers, and we would see low forb establishment. On the contrary, if we were to take a turfgrass species that's got a thinner leaf blade, doesn't need as many nutrients, and has a slower rate of growth, the idea is that this would leave more of the canopy in the ground available for flowers to establish, and we would see stronger forb establishment in a lawn of this nature. So we never just take a hypothesis and state it as fact. In the world of science, we have to test every claim that we make, and that's exactly what was done at the University of Minnesota. Where actually a grad student who came before me, his name is Ian Lane, he put this idea to a test. He took the four most common species of turfgrass used in the cool season United States, that being Kentucky bluegrass, hard fescue, which is a type of fine fescue, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass, and ask the simple question, how do these four different grasses grow alongside a common flower? That flower was a clover species, and if we quickly look at the grasses that were examined here, two of them, the Kentucky bluegrasses and the hard fescues, have a little bit of a slower rate of growth and a thinner leaf blade, while the other two species, the tall fescue and the perennial ryegrass, have a little bit of a thicker leaf blade and a faster rate of growth. So these bottom two with the thicker leaf blades and faster rate of growth are species we would expect to be highly competitive, and the slow growers with thin leaf blades, we would expect them to be a little bit less competitive. And we did find, exactly in line with our expectations, that the species that we thought would be less competitive allowed for far more floral vegetation and floral blooms in the turfgrass stand. So, the fine fescues and the Kentucky bluegrass, those species with the error bar with an A there, those species were found to have 9 times the blooms as compared to their other turfgrass counterparts, the perennial ryegrass and the tall fescue. All of this to simply say the turfgrass species you have in your lawn will have a tremendous impact on how many floral blooms you see in your yard. So if you want to have a lot of food for bees, it starts with choosing the right grasses. So ultimately, we've got two grasses to choose from here, the fine fescues and the Kentucky bluegrass. Our absolute favorite grass to use here is the fine fescues, and that's because of their value when it comes to natural resource conservation. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. So if we're thinking about grasses from a natural resource conservation point of view, we're going back to those low input qualities that we were mentioning before. So the benefits of the fine fescues, first, the low fertility needs. Typically, Kentucky bluegrass, you're recommended to provide 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet within a given year. For fine fescues, the recommendation is 1/2 of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year, or 1/6 the total amount of nitrogen needed. So way less of those nitrogen fertilizers applied, way less potential for runoff from those fertilizers. My absolute favorite benefit, and one of the main reasons I use fine fescues in my own yard, they are slow growing. I would rather do quite about anything else on a beautiful spring, summer, fall day than mow my lawn. Fine fescues are much more slow growing than that of a typical turfgrass and that of Kentucky bluegrass. The typical recommendation for a fine fescue yard is to mow 2 to 4 times per year, a whole heck of a lot less than that of Kentucky bluegrass, where the typical is to mow once every 7 to 10 days during the growing season. The fine fescues also have very strong drought tolerance. Um, what's typical for most residents is to water their Kentucky bluegrass lawns at least once per week. Some folks will do it even every other day during periods of drought. The fine fescues, the typical watering recommendation is once every 3 weeks in the spring and fall, once every 2 weeks in the summer. So the water savings there are quite quite large. Um, the only negatives when it comes to the fine fescues and when these Kentucky bluegrasses can still be a really great option for inclusion within a bee lawn, the fine fescues don't have great traffic tolerance. They can handle, light walking, regular activity. But if you have a yard where you've got dogs or kids, friends, neighbors, whoever that are really using this as a high intensity surface, lots of play, lots of heavy foot traffic, you're playing fetch with the dog or ball with whoever. Fine fescues aren't really built for that. You'll never see it as an athletic field turf, but Kentucky bluegrass can absolutely take that kind of a beating. So, thinking more about the different elements of a bee lawn, we've now covered which turfgrass species are best suited for a bee lawn and why. Now we'll talk about the floral species that we like to use within a bee lawn. So there are a few boxes that we need to check when considering which floral species we want to use within a bee lawn. First and foremost, they need to tolerate lawn management practices. And the real main thing we're talking about here is they have to be able to tolerate and continue to bloom after mowing. So some people think a bee lawn means no mowing ever. That's not quite the case. It's really more so less mowing. And if a plant were to just die after being mowed, that really wouldn't be sufficient. We really want plants that can continue to tolerate and bloom through that mowing event. Two, we want these plants to serve as high quality forage for our wild bees. This goes back to the idea of the intentional selection of plants. Lots of folks will ask me, hey, I've got some creeping Charlie in my yard. Can I just keep that going? And unfortunately, creeping Charlie is kind of like the McDonald's of the floral world from a pollinator's point of view. Yes, bees will visit it just like your kids or grandkids might want to visit McDonald's, but that doesn't mean that it's high quality forage for them. It doesn't make its pollen readily available to flowers. The creeping Charlie doesn't. And its nectar uses this interesting reward distribution theory called jackpot theory, where the vast majority of the flowers have little to no nectar, but every now and then there's a flower that's booming with nectar. It is pull tabs for bees. Every now and then they pull the winner, think this is a great investment of my energy. But as we all know, the best way to spend your money is not on pull tabs. The best way for a bee to spend its energy is not on creeping Charlie. And of course, we try to incorporate native flowers. This is something that does have its hiccups. The vast majority of flowers that were trialed were native flowers. I believe 80% of the flowers that were trialed during the initial assays for the Belon experiment were native species, but unfortunately, they didn't all establish well. We continue to do some digging here to find some more potential options. I'll talk about one today that's super exciting that we're seeing a tremendous amount of success with, but we do still incorporate some non-native species under the premise that if a non-native species, one, will not outcompete natives, and two, provides high quality rewards to pollinators, we still view it as a net positive. So let's start with self-heal, one of the native species that does exceptionally well. We'll talk about this plant from both a gardener's point of view and a pollinator's point of view. So if I'm a bee, I'm looking at this and I see a medium to large sized bloom, or at least what's important to me is a whorled bloom. A whorled bloom would be the opposite of an open bloom, where rather than having a bloom that's wide open for bees, it's a little bit closed off. Where if you look at the floral neck of this flower, what's called the corolla of the flower, it's got an extended corolla, which means that if a bee is going to get in there and get its rewards, you need to have a long bee tongue to get in there. That does kind of restrict the types of pollinators that are able to access the rewards within this flower. The historical research suggested that this flower was primarily a nectar source for bees, and this is a flower that does well in both full and part sun, meaning that if you are someone who knows they have a shadier yard, this is a great fit for that yard because it has quite strong shade tolerance, and it can do well in moist soils. So maybe you're fighting through some tough clay soils or some tougher shady yard. This is a species that's pretty vulnerable to those, excuse me, pretty strong through those conditions. Creeping Thyme, a little bit of the opposite as compared to the self-heal. It's got these teeny tiny wide open blooms that lends itself quite nicely to smaller pollinators. Creeping Thyme has very strong drought tolerance and winter hardiness, two qualities that are very important here in Minnesota. And it does function as a natural deer deterrent. A little bit about soil types when it comes to this flower. If you are in a part of Minnesota that is notorious for its sandy soils, think Anoka County, for example. This is likely to be the number one most prominent species you see in your bee lawns. It does exceptionally well in those well-drained, sandier soils. So you'll see this smaller, whitish, pinkish flower, and the bees that love to inhabit it all throughout the summer, if those are your soil conditions. If you have a clay soil, you won't see quite as much of the creeping time. And if you've got a rich black dirt, lucky you, you'll see a little bit of everything. Dutch white clover has these nice open medium-sized blooms. It's a great source of both pollen and nectar. There's been extensive research done by some of the big nutritional quality floral nerds out there. Ty Ralston, if anyone does their pollen and nectar nutritional quality reading, which I'm realizing is probably few and far between. But what's really great about Dutch white clover is it's a natural nitrogen fixer. It's from the legume family, meaning it takes that atmospheric nitrogen, fixes it back into the soil to make it readily available to plants. I often tell folks that I have never fertilized a bee lawn, and the primary reason for that is the inclusion of Dutch white clover. You don't need to apply nitrogen to your lawn when the clover is fixing that nitrogen from the atmosphere. It's estimated that the nitrogen fixation by clover is the equivalent of the application of 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet throughout the duration of a year. When we remember that the fine fescue turfgrass only requires half of that, half a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year, you're well on your way to never applying fertilizer ever again. Common violet is a species I love to talk about. The negative on this species is simply that it's not available from seed. This is a species that spreads incredibly via those rhizomes, those above ground stems, but is a very poor yielder of seed. I know this because I've spoken to just about every seed producer in the country, begging them to try and harvest this species to me, and they tell me that it just simply does not yield enough seed for it to be profitable. But that being said, if you can find it in plugs, if you've got it in your yard, if you have a neighbor who has it in their yard, you throw a couple plugs into your yard, you'll be off to the races. It spreads exceptionally well once it's in a yard. Something else that I love is it blooms early in the year. If we think about when flowers bloom in the state of Minnesota, we get a whole lot right about now, those core summer months, June, July, August. But earlier in the year, April, May, not too much. Later in the year, September, October, not too much. This helps to fill that early season gap. The benefits of common violet. So I've talked a lot about creating food for bees. This there's some food here and there. It's not the best source of food, but what it is it's a great source of habitat. There are some pollinator species that will only lay their eggs on violets, where it's a key host plant for those species. So if you want to support some of those pollinators that are very specific to where they lay their eggs and specifically like common violet, they need it in order to have a space to lay. Common violet's a great option. Another thing is, I don't know how we got to the point in our society where we thought that a green carpet is more beautiful than a landscape full of flowers. I personally think that this is a gorgeous aesthetic within the lawn, this and all the other flowers we'll talk about today. But of course, I'm very biased in this subjective point of view. So we've talked a little bit about the flowers that show up. These flowers aren't useful unless pollinators are visiting. So let's talk a little bit about those pollinators. So the self-heal, we've got these larger blooms, these whorled blooms where you need a big bee tongue. Right in line with our expectation, we see a ton of bumblebees on this flower. This is our good friend Bombus impatiens, the eastern bumblebee, one of the most common bee species not only in the United States, but right here in the state of Minnesota. What we did not expect were these smaller bees. This one from the genus Osmia, but many, many small bees. what we actually found was that the bees would crawl into the flowers, down into the corolla, get their rewards, crawl out, and fly away. So they weren't doing it the traditional way of just sticking your tongue in. They were crawling into the flowers to get their food, but it was still being used by small bees nonetheless. So if we're thinking about all of the bees in the spectrum of the bee world, the small bees, the large bees, you're seeing the itty bitty guys, the big bees, and kind of not that gap if the mid-sized bees. The data also suggested that this was a primarily a nectar source for pollinators. What was really exciting is that we saw evidence to suggest that this flower is also a source of protein. So if we're thinking about bees and their flower use, nectar use is great, but bees are no different than little kids. They'll get their sugar from just about anything, but when it comes to getting their protein, they are far more specific. When we talk about a bee being a specialist bee, we're talking specifically about its behavior in gathering pollen. And when we look at a bumblebee and we see this activity, moving its legs through its hairs, brushing that pollen down into its pollen sacs, that is a key indicator that a bee is collecting pollen off of a flower because we see this combing behavior. If you are a bee nerd like me and you see combing behavior on a flower that you weren't expecting, banner day in my world. And it should be a banner day in your world if you're attending this workshop about pollinator conservation. Um, our quick 30 seconds of bee identification. If you ever want to impress a fellow nerd who cares about pollinators, and you see a bee with this clear W outline on its abdomen, that is the clear indicator of our good friend Bombus bimaculatus. You ever want to impress someone out there, look for that W, Bombus bimaculatus, pretty common bee species here in the state of Minnesota. Oh, we already saw that. So if there's one factoid that I want folks to leave knowing about the self-heal species, it's that more than 95% of the bee visitors observed on self-heal were found to be native species. There's one plant you're going to put in the ground that's really, really, really going to attract primarily natives. It's the self-heal. So creeping thyme, we mentioned small open blooms, great for small bees, and that's exactly what we saw. A small sweat bee here from the genus Ogochlorella. And many friends just like it. Small bees all over it in the mid to late summer. If you go outside on a day like today and you have creeping thyme, you'll see small sweat bees all over this flower. This is prime time of the season for creeping thyme. And that timing is really the key to this flower. It is a late blooming source of forage. So I mentioned before, folks' yards are booming June, July, August. As summer fades into fall, our blooms are less prominent, but this is a species that still runs strong. So the fact that it is up and blooming when fewer floral species are present means it's of tremendous value to our pollinators. So if there's one thing that I want folks to remember about the creeping thyme, it's that it is the latest to bloom of all the bee lawn flowers. Dutch white clover, one of the superstars of the bee lawn world, we see small to large sized visitors. The power of this species is the sheer diversity of species that it attracts. We see sweat bees like this one from the genus Acopostymon. We see solitary bees. There's dozens upon hundreds, probably, of species of solitary bees in Minnesota, many of which will use the Dutch white clover. We see bumblebees. This is Bombus rufosinctus. We also see bumblebees of specific conservation concern. Bombus fervidus would be an example of that. I believe the fire-bellied bumblebee. Don't quote me on that, but Bombus fervidus, I'm better at my Latin names, is a species of conservation concern that we see on the Dutch white clover. And we do see the honeybee, an important consideration of the honeybee, a very controversial bee species. It is more akin to domesticated livestock than it is a true wild bee species. It's kept by beekeepers, it's shipped throughout the United States for food production efforts. When we think about conserving wild bees, we're not really thinking about the honeybee, but that doesn't mean that it's not a species of value. If you are someone who likes to eat in the United States and wants pollinators to pollinate much of the food that we eat, honeybees are involved in the pollination of about one-third of all of the food that we eat in the United States. They're important sources of pollination. They're important to our crop production, but they are not native to the United States. They are from Russia and Italy. They're from Europe. So if we see a honeybee on a flower, that's great, but they're not the specific species we're trying to support here. They're kind of just a side benefit in this world. So Dutch white clover, a critical source for honeybees and native bees alike. In total, we see more than 55 bee species on Dutch white clover in just Minneapolis, including honeybees. That 55 number might not sound like too much. That's almost 10% of all of the bees in the state of Minnesota. And if we think about all of our bee lawn flowers that we've talked about thus far, we see more than 65 bee species in total across all of these flowers, which is right around 15% of all the bees in Minnesota. Truth be told, I have to run the numbers on that again. Our beautiful bee lab just over in St. Paul has the audacity to keep identifying new bee species, new state records here in Minnesota. So I truthfully have to see if we're closer to 10% or 15% now. A new species that is super, super exciting to me that we've been doing a lot of work with and a lot of really exciting work that yields optimism is the species yak yarrow. If any of you are familiar with the species common yarrow, this is a naturally occurring subspecies of that common yarrow. The primary difference being your common yarrow is blooming at somewhere between 12 and 18 inches, 12 and 24 inches maybe. Yak yarrow will bloom as low as 3 to 4 inches off the ground. It's attractive to pollinators, bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, you name it. And it also has exceptional drought tolerance. So, of course, our primary goal is pollinator conservation here, but what shouldn't be lost on us is the importance of natural resource conservation. If you want a resilient yard that's going to be more water friendly, using species that simply don't require as much irrigation is going to be of tremendous value. This is something that nerds out there just like me do research on. Um, there's an organization out there called NTEP, the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, where part of what they do is evaluate all sorts of turfgrass and turfgrass alternatives for how drought tolerant they are. And yak yarrow is one of the top performing species across all of those trials. So if you're looking for a species that's going to thrive under low input management, low water use, yak yarrow is a fantastic option. Um, so many folks ask me what a good floral alternative is to a turfgrass lawn, and their first thought is almost always Dutch white clover. Yak Arrow blows it away in terms of its performance as a lawn alternative. It's not to say that you shouldn't use the Dutch white clover, but using these two together is of tremendous value, and if I had to pick one, it would certainly be the Yak Arrow. So Yak Arrow, we started using it in 2022. This is the literal first picture I ever received from a resident of Yak Arrow on a lawn. And from there, this was when it was an experimental flower. Now we've really been pushing folks to use it, and we see it truly thriving. What you'll notice is the vast majority of blooms are white, but some have this natural variation of having this pink to hot pink color, where we're seeing this flower popping up all over in the yards now because it is super easy to establish. What I try to not get lost in is this idea that there's more to life than a flower's value to pollinators. It also has to be easy for gardeners. There are some species that we've tried that are good for pollinators, that are, coming at the right cost in terms of making this feasible for you, the end consumer. But my gosh, are they an arm and a leg to get established? Whereas yak yarrow, heck, you set it and forget it. You throw some seed out there, you water it a little, sure enough, it pops up. And it is just a gorgeous species. We're seeing it all over. We're seeing it play nicely with the other flowers. This is one of the only belons where I've seen the thyme, the heel, the yarrow, and the clover all blooming at the same time, which for a nerd like me is super duper exciting. So the yak yarrow, newer species to the belon fold, but boy oh boy are we excited about it. Great for pollinators, easy to get established, super inexpensive yak yarrow is. There are flowers out there. My goodness, if I could cut the price of pussy toes down by $1,000 per pound, I would use it in a heartbeat. This is something that costs 10% of what a pussy toes costs. And if any of you are out there trying to find what would be a great business, if any of you can produce pussy toes at less than, let's call it $500 per pound, I'll be the number one customer. So there is a world outside of bees that is important to some folks. Granted, if you don't like bees, I probably don't want to be your friend, but I still want you to do something that's good for the environment. I'm yet to meet someone who doesn't care about local food production, doesn't like to eat delicious food. There's been some great research out of the greater Chicagoland area that found that converting at least 5% of a lawn to some pollinator-friendly alternative can improve pollination at local urban gardens and local urban farms. So if you're talking to someone that doesn't give a hoot about pollinators, about why they should be planting for pollinators, heck, if they like good locally sourced food, if you like your farmers markets throughout the state of Minnesota, this is a great thing to do to support local food production. So we've talked about all of the fun stuff. What grasses should we use? What flowers should we use? What bees are we attracting? None of this is important if we can't get our plants in the ground. Let's talk about how and when and why we should use certain techniques and timings, etc., for making this planting a true reality. Timing, undoubtedly, I would say, the number one source of failure that I see among folks. 1B, 1A, 1B, I would say, for why some folks have trouble getting these established. There are three periods of time that are exceptional for getting a bee lawn established, and there is one timing that I absolutely beg folks to try and avoid. A great time to do this is the early spring, right after the snow melt. Maybe our ground is still a little bit moist. Um, the benefit of this time of year is you will see same year germination and even some year one flowering, at least of the Dutch white clover and even possibly the yak, yarrow, and self heal. And if you need to overseed a little bit, there's still time left in the fall to do a little bit of overseeding. The main reason that this can be a little bit spotty in terms of success, the spring is the most difficult time for competition from weedy species. Those early spring weeds are an absolute burden. They have a strong chance of outcompeting the flowers we're trying to get established here. If you know that you have a lawn that is prone to competition with weeds, I would probably aim for a different window of time. If you have a yard that is predominantly weed free, the spring is an excellent option for when to establish and seed a bee lawn. The late summer, mid-August to mid-September, if any of you have a calendar or are aware of the date, we are in early August, meaning that this window is right around the corner. It is my favorite time to establish a bee lawn. Um, Weed pressure is dissipating. We're going to have those warm days and cool nights. Your soil temperatures are going to be absolutely pristine for getting a bee lawn established. Those soil temps between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. What'll happen here is the you'll only see vegetation this fall, but come the following spring, your bee lawn will overwinter. You'll get some of that cold stratification for the species that benefit from a cold stratification, and you'll be full of blooms in year two and beyond. So year one, mostly vegetation with a late summer, early fall seeding. Year two, flowers galore. The only thing we have to be privy to is that if we wait on the later end of that window, that mid even into late September window, and we happen to get an early hard frost, that could spell danger to some of the flowers. But climate change, if we're able to call it that, but the tendency for our summers to extend later than they used to does have some benefits that come along with it, including less prevalent early frosts. So we're really encouraging folks to use this planting technique more and more, as our falls tend to be more and more mild and our onsets to winter tend to be later. A dormant seeding is another fantastic option. I would say that when Minnesota has a typical Minnesota winter, this is a fantastic option. What happens here is you time your planting just before the first hard frost. I used to say early mid-November. Now I say right before the first hard frost. Sometimes that can be December. In 2023, we didn't really have a true hard frost. But if you can get that seed down before that first hard frost, the snow and ice cover is going to function as a free germination blanket. You'll get instant cold stratification, that process of freezing and thawing, which many seeds need in order to establish and grow effectively, and you'll get beautiful germination and establishment the following spring, summer, and fall. Snow cover, should we be lucky enough to get it, aids in establishment. In the event that we do not get that snow and ice cover, the best thing you can do is put down a germination blanket. I'll talk a little bit more about those later. So, in terms of technique, there are two techniques that are most common for installing a bee lawn. The first is overseeding. You drop the seed right over the top of your grass. The second is a new lawn renovation. You tear it all up and start from scratch. Obviously, one is a whole lot easier than the other, but what's important here is knowing when to use which technique. And overseeding is a great option when you have the right grass species, either Kentucky bluegrass or fine fescue, and that lawn of yours has low weed presence. Weeds are biological competitors. A very weedy lawn is going to outcompete your bee lawn flowers. If you have some other turfgrass species as the predominant type within your yard, or you have a yard with high weed presence, a new lawn renovation is likely going to be your best bet. The cutoff that I typically use here for the term high weed presence If more than one third of your yard is weed coverage, you're probably gonna have a really tough time getting those flowers established in here, and I would just start from scratch. So let's start with the overseeding example because boy, it's quick and easy. You can get all this work done in an hour. So again, when to overseed? You've got the right grasses present, limited weeds, and again, oh, very quickly. So we talked about three great times to do this work. What I beg folks to do is avoid the heat of summer when we're planting anything from seed, a bee lawn, turf grass, flowers. Hot soil is soil that does not want plants to germinate within it. Unless you want to water 5 to 7 times a day, aim to plant in one of these three windows, the spring, late summer to fall transition, or the late fall to dormant seeding, and avoid the dead heat of summer. But yes, back to the to how to get this done. A new lawn renovation where we take out the old grass, put in new plants, and go from there. So, an overseeding example, step one, we mow the lawn as short as possible, the lowest setting on your mower. We rake away the clippings to expose as much soil as possible, where the key here is that seeds will not germinate unless they are making contact with the soil. So, doing these first two steps helps to ensure that those seeds are making their way to the soil. Three, we spread the seed. Many folks will use compost or sand as bulking agents to help spread that seed out. And then what we want to do is we want to keep these areas moist until they sprout. Bee lawns are very low input once they're established and mature. To get to that establishment and maturity phase, we need to germinate them properly, which means ideally 3 waterings per day, 5 to 7 minutes of water 3 times per day, and you're golden. In terms of how to maintain a bee lawn, just the very basics, we'll talk more about this later. One, never mow below 3 inches. These flowers bloom at 3 inches and taller. Two, at least one mow per year. I tell folks to at least trim it up in the fall. Having less plant material to overwinter makes it easier for those plants to overwinter and survive. And please, please, please do not apply herbicides to your flowers. They will kill your bee lawn. So once you've got a bee lawn present, no more herbicide. You will absolutely kill a bee lawn if you apply herbicide. So let's say you don't have these optimal conditions. You've either got a different grass species or you've got a really weedy yard. Then your best bet is to do a new lawn renovation. So you start from scratch, either a sod cutter or a solarization or some other technique. We'll talk about a few of those. So there is an initial investment of resources, whether it's money, time, effort, a combination of all of those or others. But we do often see improved overall results because we're seeing perfect seed to soil contact ratios. Um, I personally had a situation that might not be too foreign to many Minnesotans. I had grubs absolutely decimate my front yard. What grubs do is they eat the root system such that you can pull up your turf grass like you're pulling up a carpet. For most folks, that's a tremendous burden. For me, it was a great opportunity to have a free sod cutter come and do my dirty work. I peeled up the turf grass, planted a bee lawn, and I guess I was oddly grateful to have grubs. But the point being, you remove the turf grass, you remove the vegetation, and you plant the seed directly onto your soil. You can do this renovation in any number of ways, from more old school conventional methods to newer, more cutting edge kind of options. So you see a woman over here using a shovel. This is about the largest area I would ever recommend trying to do with a shovel. Boy, oh boy, where will you start to feel the pain once you get a few hundred square feet deep with just a shovel. Many folks will use a dingo or some other techniques, some cultural techniques that we'll discuss here. So we already talked about the shovel. What I heavily prefer is the sod cutter. A sod cutter is a tool that you can rent from a local small equipment shop for 20, 30, $40 a day, something in that range. And boy, oh boy, does it make your life a whole lot easier. It's got a blade that runs underneath the turf, pulls it right up, makes it very easy to remove, saves you a lot of time and effort. If you're working in a larger area, say around the 500 plus square foot range, 500 to 2,000 square feet, something that I would say is manageable, but you really want to have a sturdy piece of equipment to work through it, I'd say a sod cutter is going to be your best friend here. And if you're doing a really large project, but we see the individual in the right using a dingo is going to be a really great option for you. So pretty much the more land we're looking to use, the heavier the equipment we want to help us with, because boys, is your back going to hurt if you try to do it all by hand. Some cultural methods that are great. We'll talk about two of them. What I want you to keep in mind about cultural methods and really all these options is there's always going to be some degree of give and take. You can save money by doing something that's a lot of effort. You can use a tool. It'll be more expensive. It won't be backbreaking, but it'll cost a little bit more. These cultural techniques, they are relatively easy. They are not super expensive, but they do take quite a bit of time. If you're looking for instant results, a solarization and the technique we'll talk about after sheet mulching might not be for you. But if you leave yourself proper time, these are fantastic options to use. So I'm going to give the quick elevator pitch on solarization and sheet mulching, but you'll see that I've posted the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They've got a guide about organic site preparation that is absolutely phenomenal, much more thorough than the 90 seconds I'm about to do here on two techniques. But without further ado, a solarization. You cover the area you wish to convert in a clear or black plastic. I've seen folks use both with success. You tamp it down with whatever material you've got to tamp down your plastic, and you let it sit for, I would say, at least 3 months. If you've got full sun, 3 months. If you've got partial sun, I'd go for 4 months. Over time, it's basically going to bake. The vegetation is going to bank underneath that solarization material, the solarization plastic. Heat it to the point where the vegetation dies. 3 to 4 months later, you peel back the plastic, you rake away the dead plants, and you've got a bare surface to plant into. Sheet mulching. Many of you are probably familiar with this. I often call it lawn lasagna, where what you're doing, you mow it down to the lowest height possible, your vegetation, your turf grass, and you're just going to cover it in layers of compost, followed by cardboard, followed by a deep, heavy soak. This is actually how I installed my own pollinator garden with a sheet mulching. Um, what many folks will do is they'll use a cover crop in year one as the cardboard is decomposing into the compost to kind of renovate that vegetative area, and they'll plant their desired final form of vegetation the following spring. You can potentially just drop some seed over the top of it, but I would expect it to be a multi-year process. So sheet mulching, mow it low, do your layers of compost, cardboard, and moisture, and then after about two full layers, you're good to plant some vegetation into that area that you've sheet mulched. So seeding a bee lawn, yes, believe it or not, there is some science in how you actually spread that seed out. So first off, many folks try to do it by hand, which can be fine. We always recommend as much precision as possible. Whether you have got the hand crank option or a true broadcast spreader that you push throughout your lawn, anything that's going to distribute your seed evenly is going to give you better results. What's also beneficial is doing what's called a perpendicular seeding, spreading half of your seed walking in the north-south direction, the other half of your seed walking in the east-west direction. So if we're aiming for 5 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet, we're doing 2.5 walking north-south, 2.5 going east-west. What I often tell folks to do is do anything besides just simply leaving the seed laying on top of the soil. If you were to do that, what you've created is a very expensive bird feeder where the birds are going to pick off a lot of that seed. Just gently, lightly rake that seed into the soil, or even top dress with a little bit of soil to gently cover your seed. From there, one heavy watering and then a light and frequent watering program. Ideal is to water 3 times per day for 5 to 7 minutes. I would say at a bare minimum, try and get out there once per day, turn it on your sprinkler, hitting it with the hose to make sure it gets at least a little bit of moisture throughout the year. In 2025, we've been lucky enough to have a very, very moist year, which is great for growing plants. But in other years where there's less water, definitely try and get out there at least once per day. Germination blankets. So I mentioned top dressing, and I also mentioned raking your seed in. Germination blankets are another great option for you. They do a few things really nicely. One, they keep the seed in place. You don't have to worry about it getting washed away or blown away. And two, they reduce how much direct sunlight hits your lawn area. That means slower evapotranspiration. That means less water that you need to apply yourself. If it's evaporating more slowly, the water's made more available to the grasses they're establishing, grasses and flowers. So a germination blanket is another great thing to use. The number one mistake I see folks make with germination blankets is they hear the term germination blanket, they think what they're using is a forever blanket. These germination blankets are strictly for the first 3 weeks after you put down the seed. You seed it, you put the germination blanket down, and 3 weeks later, you just peel it up. When the vegetation gets super tall, it's going to be a giant pain in the behind to pull these blankets up. If you take it off after that 3 weeks when the grass is still itty bitty babies, you're in the clear. So, how to install a bee lawn if you're doing this as a new lawn renovation. So, if the lawn doesn't have a bunch of creeping Charlie invasives that'll spread, oh, excuse me. Yes. So this is how you can do a new lawn renovation. You remove the turf by hand, machine, or some cultural method. Many folks, when they're spreading the seed out, will add a bulking agent or something to amend the soil, like compost or a soil amendment. Many folks like my personal favorite is a mixture of compost and black dirt. You spread that through the area, you break it up with a rake, and then you spread the seed, lightly raking the seed into the soil. If you leave it right on top, birds are going to pick it off. I strongly recommend covering with a germination blanket. If you don't do that, raking it in or top dressing is a great option. Keep it moist until sprouting, where once this starts growing, then it's all the same methods as before. Never mow below 3 inches, trim it back in the fall, and do not apply herbicides. A quick little cut sheet on the compare and contrast of overseeding versus a new lawn renovation, when to do which, what your seed mix might look like, where there are flowers only versions of the bee lawn, where heck, if you've already got fine fescue, no need to apply more of it, and kind of the benefits of one versus the other. Where obviously, if you're overseeding, it's likely to be a more cost-effective option. You're not running out to rent a sod cutter. So ongoing maintenance, lucky for all of us, this is the shortest section of the Belon workshop because the work is in getting this established. Once it's established and mature, your maintenance is minimal. So again, the maintenance during that plant establishment phase, that's going to be the most intensive. Water frequently during that establishment phase, at least once per week. Through the first year, cut your watering back to maybe once per twice a week. And what's really going to be helpful, especially if you know your lawn is susceptible to weed pressure, is to try and weed your lawn 2 to 3 times per year. Something that I know the folks at Metro Blooms often share with folks is using the major summer holidays as kind of like a weeding timeline. Um, honor before Labor Day, honor before the 4th of July, and the late fall as well. If you hit the early spring, the midsummer, and the late fall, you're good to go. Mowing, regular maintenance of mowing here for you. Just you're doing less work. It's a great benefit. We recommend mowing based on height. When the lawn reaches 6 inches in height, mow it down to 4 inches. It's as simple as that. Most folks are mowing somewhere between 2 to 4 times per year. If you get more direct sunlight in your yard, you're probably looking at 4 times a year. If you're looking at a sunshade mix, probably close to twice a year. Fertilizer. I've never once fertilized a bee lawn. The fine fescue needs very, very little fertilizer. If you're doing any of these things, leaving your clippings in your lawn, allowing Dutch white clover in your lawn, you're not going to need the fertilizer. You're getting enough nitrogen back naturally. You don't need to apply it from a bag and risk the runoff associated with it. Irrigation, another tremendous benefit here. Most folks are irrigating their traditional turfgrass lawns somewhere between every other day to at least once a week. A bee lawn, you're watering once every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the season. Thatch removal. If there's one thing we're going to add to our lawn regime, it would be a thatch removal once per year. Part of what happens when we mow less frequently is we do allow more decomposition of plant material in that layer between the soil and the growing plant material. That's what thatch is. So after the spring green up, maybe late April, early May, it all depends on how the spring hits that year in Minnesota. Run a dethatcher through your yard once, or rake the heck out of it to remove that thatch. But this is one thing that we would often recommend folks add to their lawn maintenance program when they've got a bee lawn present. So, the last thing that I want to say about here, I've talked a ton about pollinators. I don't want it to get lost on us how much more environmentally friendly bee lawns are as compared to a traditional turf grass lawn from a natural resource conservation point of view. This research comes from Ohio State University. They asked a super simple question. That question was, What is the carbon footprint associated with maintenance in a traditional turfgrass lawn, what we would call a heavy management or a high management lawn, as compared to a low management lawn, where we use species that don't need to be babied and coddled, like the fine fescues, like the flowers included within a bee lawn? And what they found was that the carbon footprint associated with maintenance was one third in a low maintenance lawn as compared to a high maintenance lawn. And here they were just looking at two simple things: fertilizer application, the carbon footprint associated with applying those fertilizers, as well as the carbon footprint associated with mowing. So if you want to very easily cut your carbon footprint down within your lawn area, within the management associated with the lawn, switching from a high input Kentucky bluegrass to a low input option is going to do wonders. Okay, and at this point, we'll open it up to questions. You could hear my lovely cat Ed has some questions himself, but we'll leave it to your questions.
Amazing. Thank you, James. I'm gonna move back up to the top of the chat. Some of these were kind of already addressed when you got more into the different
Mhm.
installation methods. But Carol asked about what to do with existing crabgrass overgrowth in terms of fescue seeds and competition. Don't know if you want to add anything onto that.
Yeah, there's a number of options here. So if the weed presence is very, very extensive, you will likely want to do this as part of a new lawn renovation. Crabgrass is very difficult to get rid of. I wish you could very easily just remove it by hand or with your dandelion popper. What's likely going to be your best bet is one of those cultural practices like a solarization or sheet mulch, or even using an herbicide. So, of course, I know that in the world of eco-friendly minded folks, an herbicide is never anyone's favorite thing to do. But when we're thinking about the long-term benefits, if you use an herbicide once, you use it responsibly, you follow the label, um, it's one step back to take three steps forward. If we're replacing our turf grass lawn, which we just saw the carbon footprint associated with those, with something with a tremendously reduced carbon footprint, something that provides food for pollinators, using a herbicide, likely an ideally an herbicide with low toxicity, can provide, tremendous value in terms of preparing your area for planting.
Got it. Question from Mary. If bees are laying eggs on the violets, if I mow, will I be killing bee eggs? When should I be mowing the bee lawns?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily the bees that are laying their eggs. It's mostly lepidopterans that would be doing that. Butterflies and moths and skippers, things like that. They are laying their eggs early in the spring. Um, if you wanted to hold off until the late spring, maybe like late May to mow, you'd probably be in the clear there. Um, yeah, so that's what I would do. I'd, maybe hold off to late May for mowing. Our grass is growing pretty darn slowly up until mid to late May anyway. So, and that goes for most vegetation. But yeah, if you wait quite a bit, you should be good to go.
Got it. Um, Tristan says that they've solarized their front lawn due to heavy weed growth, and just and asking would a fall planting still work well?
Yeah, if you've gotten at least 3 months of solarization in, you should be good to go. 3 months tends to be the magic number. I'd always refer back to that guide from the Xerxes Society. If I know Megan like I think I do, I'd imagine Megan already posted the link to that in the chat.
Nope,
Um,
but I can.
I we know what happens when we assume. I just make myself look silly. hmm
Cool. Just
But it's
checking.
it's a great tool. It's a great tool, that Xerxes Society Guide to Organic Site Preparation.
Yeah. Um, okay. Common theme here. Andrea shares that their yard is overwhelmed by extreme, hardy, thick, and nearly impossible to get rid of lamb's quarter and very little turf. How should I prep the area? Is tilling appropriate to get the roots out? Don't know if
Gosh,
any perspectives on that.
the only time tilling ever really works is when it's paired with herbicide use. What tilling will do without herbicide use is it'll just bring a whole ton of weed seed to the forefront. So I tend to not like tilling, or if you're gonna till, it does unfortunately mean you're probably gonna have to use um, an herbicide in conjunction with it. But yes, either
Mhm.
using one of those organic site preparation tactics or doing a one-time application of herbicide, doing it responsibly to reduce exposure to pollinators, and trying to use a low toxicity herbicide in terms of its impact on beneficial pollinators would be your best bet there.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Would you recommend a bee lawn for a boulevard, or will salt and other stressors be ultimately too harmful for it?
Yeah, this is actually a project that Metro Blooms has done. Um, the grasses and flowers that are used in the Belon mix actually have pretty darn good salinity tolerance. Fine fescues in particular are a mainstay of boulevards that are planted the way they should be, at least, because fine fescues are pretty notorious for having strong an ability to tolerate more salt use. So yeah, I'd say Belon's a great option for a boulevard, especially if we consider that one of the main pressures within a boulevard is you need more drought tolerance because that sidewalk is creating a little urban heat
Hmm.
island, basically. So the drought tolerance of the plants is going to be quite beneficial.
And it's a great sustainable option for dealing with the height restrictions on a
Hmm.
lot of city boulevards too.
True.
Uh, Jenny shares that they are having an issue with voles for the past 2 years, and but have used grub killer twice this year, and it seems to be working. Can I try doing a V-Lawn and still use grub killer every year?
Yep, that's no problem at all. When it comes to controlling grubs, I would definitely read some of the university's educational materials on when and how to control grubs. Many folks will think that they are controlling grubs, but grubs are very seasonal. Um, grub control should take place in the month of like mid June through mid July. Grubs that's when the application is going to be most effective. We want to target the early instar larvae or juvenile larvae, young larvae. Um, Many people will think that the grubs have vanished from their lawn when in reality they've just um, become adults. Those beetles in our yard, so they're just no longer in your lawn due to their natural life cycle. So definitely give some of the materials from the University of Minnesota Extension a try.
Cool. Um, and Judy is curious about Twin City Seeds native V-Lawn mix.
Yeah, gosh, I do. We still it still exists. It's at Mother Earth Gardens. The self heal is fantastic. The yak arrow is fantastic. Some of the two other species we like to use had a crop failure this year. That would be the narrowleaf blue-eyed grass and the wild petunia. So we're really trying to find that third option to make it more of a reality. But gosh, there's so many expensive that are either just wildly expensive or really tough to get growing. Um, but I mean, there's enough demand for it where we might just put it out there as just the yarrow, self-heal, and the Dutch white, excuse me, the yarrow, the heel, and the fine fescues next year.
Okay. Okay. Carol's asking if dormant seeding on a slope before hard frost and using erosion blanket, when to remove the erosion blanket after winter or some other time frame.
Okay, I'm going to give an extremely specific answer, and then I'm going to give a much more easy to follow answer. So plants don't care about time, they care about degree days, the accumulation of warmth over time. Ideally would be if you go to a degree day calculator and you see and we enter the threshold for when early season weeds start to germinate, where Greencast Online, that's one of the thresholds. Same with Michigan State's degree day calculator. They'll show you exactly when plants are about to start germinating and blooming. The easier way to do it is when we've when you see your highs, when the norm for your high temperatures is north of 50 degrees, you can remove it. So yeah, so sometime between mid-April and mid-May probably, but whenever we start seeing regular highs north of 55 degrees, I'd say.
I think last question we have here at the moment, Jean or Jeannie says, have you considered using sedges like Pennsylvania sedge or native grass like bluegrass? Um,
Yeah,
Thoughts on
so
that?
yes, so if I had a couple extra zeros in my bank account, I would use them all day long. All day long. Pennsylvania sedge has, and other sedges too. Um, Penn sedge in particular is fantastic, but it is really difficult to come by. I've seen it much more readily available as plug plants than I have from seed. Um, we do from time to time do a combination of blue grama and buffalo grass alongside a bee lawn. Um, but it is going to be much, much, much more expensive. Blue grama and buffalo grass and little blue stem, those native grasses that can function as turf grass adjacent, are just much, much more expensive on a per pound and per thousand square foot basis as compared to the fine fescues. Um, and their effectiveness as vegetative green cover for a lawn type situation is also somewhat murky.
Mhm. Yeah. I want to address a couple of eligible expenses related
Mhm.
questions. So, um, James asked, or not James, Thomas, said that you mentioned that using non-native floral species is part of many bee law and recommended mixes. Will the grant pay for these? And to answer that question, yes. So if you look at the eligible expenses guide, we have we scroll down a bit and there's a section called non-native and cultivar exceptions. So there's a few species, bee lawn species that we specifically do reimburse for, including the Dutch white clover that James talked about, the self-heal, the yak yarrow. So take a look at that list. We've kind of structured it so a lot of the mixes that, for example, Twin City Seed Company sells are going to be eligible for the grant. Um, and then Johnny is asking, would something like hiring a landscaping company for professional bee lawn installation be something they can use the grant towards? That answer is also yes. So if you look at the eligible expenses guide, on the right-hand column, it's in the if needed category. Hiring helpers or contractors is a reimbursable expense if you're using it for essential services for your project, such as installation. So that could be something you could use your reimbursement money towards. We'll take maybe just a few minutes to create a little space here if people are still typing up any remaining questions. Um, and then, James, if people want to like stay in touch or ask any like Twin City Sea Company specific questions, what's the best way that they can reach you or the company?
Yeah, I'm throwing my email in the chat right now. I do see that oh, I'm gonna cover that one real good soon from Karen. I see your question. But just two things that folks can use twincityseed.com for our website or emailing me directly at jwolfin@twincityseed.com. So Karen asks a wonderful question here. If city ordinance says 60% green space required on my corner lot, does a B lawn qualify? I would say first, certainly that a B-lawn is absolutely green space, so a B-lawn should qualify. Something else that I love to point out to folks, and should probably create a slide in the presentation, is that recently, say right around July 1st, 2023, the state of Minnesota revamped their laws around what folks are and are not allowed to plant within the state, where it's very, very you're pretty much free to do whatever you want as long as it is intentional and cared for. Whether it's a bee lawn, whether it's a rain garden, the height restrictions have been removed. Where yeah, there's a new law through the state of Minnesota where it pretty much says that if you're not planting natives, what you're planting is intentional and it is maintained, you can do whatever you want. A bee lawn, a rain garden, a native planting, trees and shrubs, the works.
Looks like we got a couple more questions into can dormant seeding this year be successful with a one-time herbicide use the following spring?
It will not be successful. If anything, you want to flip-flop those, do an herbicide use first and then seeding second. But yeah, that herbicide will absolutely kill all the flowers you're trying to
Mhm.
plant.
Yeah. And then do you recommend aerating soil for bee lawns?
Yeah, this is something that was specifically trialed at the university, where what was found is pretty consistent with all findings on aeration, where at worst it's net neutral, at best it is a tremendous net benefit. Aeration does a couple things. Where it's gonna, the more compacted your soil is, the more beneficial aeration is going to be. Aeration is pulling those plugs of soil out of your yard. If you've ever been on like a baseball field and you've seen those cores and thought like it was goose poop everywhere, aeration is pulling out those little cores of the soil and it helps to improve the flow of water and nutrients throughout a green space. Exceptionally valuable in those compacted clay soils and a net neutral at worst in a less compacted soil. So I would say if you know you've got compacted soil, definitely aerate. Um, Otherwise, it's not too big of a deal.
Makes sense. Last call for questions.
Yeah, right of ways and stuff, those can get tricky. Um, I will say it's for good reason. It's all for safety of pedestrians. So as much as I love bees, I don't want, any issues there with the little kid chasing their ball into the street or something like that. So they're there for good reason, those rules.
Great. Well, thank you, James, for taking the time to share all of your knowledge with us tonight. Thank you, everybody, for attending, whether you're watching live or watching the recording. If you do have follow-up questions, James has shared his email. You can also reach out to the helpline, which I put there in the chat as well. Otherwise, I wish you best of luck on your Lawns to Legumes projects, whether you choose to go for the pollinator lawn or a different project type. And I hope you have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you all for spending a beautiful summer evening in this little webinar, and I hope you all have great success in your projects. Thanks to Metro Bloom's Blue Thumb staff for helping organize this and the many great years of lawn legumes we've had so far. Take care, everybody.